She was 16 years old when they put her out of the house with nothing but the clothes on her back and a carved wooden bird no bigger than her thumb. The whole of Harrow Bend said she was a thief. Her own mother would not look at her as she walked out the door. But what none of them knew, what Eliza herself could not have imagined, was that somewhere deep in the autumn hills above the valley, an old hollow tree was waiting for her. And inside that tree, buried beneath 40 years of silence and packed earth, was a secret that would change everything she thought she understood about who she was and where she came from. If you believe that the truest homes are the ones we build ourselves, then this story is for you. And before we go any further, if you find comfort in stories like this one, stories of quiet courage and unexpected grace, consider subscribing. There are more waiting for you, and we would be glad to have you with us. Harrow Bend sat in a crease between two long ridges of the southern Appalachians, the kind of place that the war had passed through like a fever and left diminished. The year was 1867, 2 autumns since Appomattox and the mountains had not recovered. The men who came back changed, and the men who did not come back left holes in their families that no amount of harvest or prayer could fill. The town itself was a scattering of weathered structures along a single road that turned to mud every time it rained, which in the Tennessee mountains was often. There was a general store, a church whose bell had cracked during a hard freeze 3 winters prior and never been replaced, and a mill on the creek that ground corn slowly and complained about it loudly. The people of Harrow Bend were not unkind by nature, but they were tired. And tired people do not always have the patience for those who are different. Thomas Collier had come home from the war with a stiffness in his left leg and a silence in him that had no name. He was not a cruel man, but he had lost something in those years between the mountains of Virginia and the marshes of Georgia, some essential warmth. And what remained was a man who made decisions the way he drove fence posts with finality, without discussion, without looking back to see what he had displaced. His wife May had kept the farm moving in his absence, had kept their 2 sons fed and the roof patched and the debts manageable. By the time Thomas returned, she had learned to run things without asking permission, and Thomas had learned to resent this without ever saying so. The space between them in the evenings was a careful and deliberate thing, measured in inches across the supper table in the direction their chairs faced. In the silence that had become so familiar, it had almost stopped feeling like silence at all. Their older son Caleb was 20, built square like his father, good with the animals and the fence line, a young man who had assumed his role as eldest with a kind of settled certainty. Their younger son Amos was 14, still soft-faced, still capable of finding wonder in small things, still in some secret way that neither his father nor his brother would have understood Eliza's favorite person in the family. And then there was Eliza. She was the 3rd child and only daughter, and she had never quite fit the shape of the life the Collier farm expected her to fit. Not because she was disobedient, she was not. She did her work without complaint. She was up before the others, and the last to stop in the evening. But her mind, even while her hands were busy, was always somewhere else. She noticed things that nobody else noticed. The way the fog collected in the low places along the creek on cold mornings and burned off in order lowest point, first moving up the slope as the sun climbed. The way the white oak on the north side of the property had begun to lean slightly west over the course of her lifetime, as if it had decided on a direction and was in no hurry to arrive. The way her father's left hand rested differently on the table now than it had before the war. Index finger crooked slightly inward, the knuckle enlarged a wound he had never spoken of. She noticed everything. She was noticed by almost no one. The person who had seen her most clearly was a man named Silas Croft. Silas had lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of the Collier property for as long as anyone in Harrow Bend could remember. He was a widower, lean and slow-moving, with hands that were enormously knuckled and permanently stained with wood dust. He had been a logger in his younger years and a carver in his old age, and his cabin was full of small wooden animals in various states of completion: owls mid-blink, foxes mid-step, a trio of geese arranged on his windowsill as if they had just landed and were deciding whether to stay. He had no children of his own, and no family that anyone knew of. The town considered him harmless and eccentric, and largely left him alone, which seemed to suit him entirely. He had begun teaching Eliza when she was 9, drawn by the same quality in her that the rest of the world found unsettling: her watchfulness, her patience, her refusal to fill silence with noise. He taught her the things his father had taught him and his father's father before that, the old knowledge of the mountains. Which roots held medicine and which held danger. How to read the sky 3 hours ahead by the shape and movement of clouds. The difference between a game trail and a deer bed. How to set a fire that would last rather than one that burned bright and fast and left nothing. How to hold a knife so that the cut served the wood rather than forcing the wood to serve the cut. For her 13th birthday, he had carved her a wren. It was small enough to close her fingers around, completely made from a single piece of birch that he had cured himself over 2 years. The bird's head was cocked at an angle that suggested it had just heard something interesting and was deciding what to make of it. Its eye was a single drop of burned ink, precise and alive. It weighed almost nothing. It was the most beautiful thing Eliza had ever been given. She kept it in the front pocket of her work dress against her hip, and whenever the days grew too heavy, whenever her father's silences became too dense, whenever her mother's exhaustion became a kind of accusation, she would close her hand around the small carved bird and feel its smooth, familiar weight, and something in her would settle. Silas died in the first cold week of October, 2 weeks before the locket went missing. He went in his sleep, which was, as Jedediah Rawls the trapper later said, exactly the way a man like Silas would have chosen to go if choosing were an option. The town came and took what was useful and burned what was not. Eliza was not consulted. She managed in the confusion of the clearing out to keep his small whittling knife hidden in the pocket of her apron. The knife and the wren were all that remained of the man who had taught her how to see. May Collier wore a locket. It was oval and gold, small enough to cup in one palm, and it had belonged to her mother, and her mother's mother before that. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman Eliza had never met, rendered in fine brushwork on ivory, wearing a dark dress and an expression of composed dignity. The locket was the single beautiful object in the Collier household. May wore it every day, and on the occasions when she did not wear it, she kept it in a small cedar box on her dresser, a box so specifically designated for this purpose that touching it felt to all the children like trespassing. On the 3rd day of November, the locket was gone. May discovered it in the late morning. The cedar box was open and empty. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long moment, the open box in both hands, as if she were waiting for the locket to reappear through sheer attention. Then she set the box down very carefully and walked into the main room and said in a voice stripped of all its usual exhaustion simply, "It's gone." What followed was quiet and methodical and devastating. Thomas went through every room of the house. He checked the floor, the bedding, the shelf above the hearth. Amos turned out his pockets with such immediate willingness that he was clearly innocent. Caleb stood in the doorway of the main room with his arms crossed, watching his expression unreadable. It was then that Eliza noticed something she could not explain and could not ignore. Caleb's right hand, the one tucked against his side, was closed, not resting. Closed. The knuckles were white. She looked at him for a moment. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed somewhere past her father's shoulder on the middle distance, on nothing. She did not know what to make of it. Caleb had never been dishonest, not in any way she had witnessed. He was her brother, solid and plain-spoken, a man their father trusted completely. The closed fist might mean anything or nothing at all. Her mind ran through other explanations, the way water runs through gravel looking for the path of least resistance. He was cold. He was tense from the search. He was holding something he had already had in his pocket before any of this began. But the whiteness of the knuckles stayed with her. She said nothing. And that silence, like so many silences in that household, became the shape her guilt was poured into. It was May who made the accusation. Not with cruelty, but with a terrible flatness, the way someone states a conclusion they have already accepted, because accepting it is easier than the alternative. She looked at Eliza across the table and said, "You were in my room yesterday afternoon. I saw you come out." This was true. Eliza had gone into her parents' room to return a pair of work gloves she had found left on the porch. She had not touched the cedar box. She had not even crossed to the dresser side of the room, but she had been there, and that was enough. Thomas asked no questions. He had already assembled his verdict by the time he turned to look at her, and she could see in the set of his jaw that he had found it satisfying. It explained things. It named the discomfort he had carried about his strange, watchful daughter for years. She had always been a little outside the family, a little apart, given to long silences and solitary walks and inexplicable competencies taught to her by the old man he had never entirely trusted. This was the shape that difference finally took. Dishonesty. Hidden and quiet and proven. Her denial was brief and made no impact. The truth did not have the right texture. The truth was, I don't know. And Harrow Bend in 1867 had no patience for I don't know. It had only patience for certainty, and the certainty was already assembled. That evening, Thomas met her at the door as she came in from banking the fire in the smokehouse. He was holding her canvas foraging sack, the one she used for collecting herbs and bark, and the occasional handful of late persimmons. It was heavier than it should have been. He held it out to her without meeting her eyes and said with a quietness that was worse than anger, "You'll not stay under this roof any longer." Inside the sack, she found later, was a half loaf of dry cornbread wrapped in cloth, a wedge of hard cheese, her spare wool tunic, and the whittling knife she had hidden in her apron after Silas's cabin was cleared. Someone had found it. Someone had decided that even this small rescued thing should be returned to her as part of her exile. She stood on the porch and looked at the sack in her hands. She looked at her father's profile, the jaw, the damaged hand resting on the doorframe, the eyes that were already looking past her toward the tree line. She looked for her mother. May was in the shadows of the main room, her back to the door. Amos was not visible. Caleb stood at the corner of the house, and for one moment, one unguarded moment, Eliza looked directly at him. He looked away first. She took a breath. She put her hand into the pocket of her dress and felt the small, carved bird, the head cocked, the ink-drop eye, the smooth birch wings. She closed her fingers around it. She adjusted the sack on her shoulder, stepped off the porch, and walked toward the tree line without looking back. The forest received her the way it always had, without ceremony, without judgment, without asking where she had been. The Appalachian Mountains in early November have a particular quality of light that does not exist anywhere else in the world, or at least nowhere Eliza had ever been, which was not many places. The sun sets early, and the ridge lines swallow the last of it before 5 o'clock, leaving a long blue dusk that settles into the hollows and stays. The leaves are mostly down by then, the oak and hickory gone to brown and rust, the sourwood already bare, and the forest opens up in a way it cannot in summer. You can see much farther through the trees, see the bones of the land, the ridges and the draws and the old rock outcroppings that the green months conceal. It is a landscape made legible by loss. Eliza walked into this. She did not run. Running was for people who had not thought past the moment of departure. She walked steadily, angling uphill the way Silas had taught her to in the late afternoon, to get above the cold air that settled in the creek bottoms after dark. She found water within the hour, a quick, shallow tributary of the main creek running clear over a bed of limestone and small gray stones. She drank. She refilled her mind with the practical. She needed shelter before full dark. Something better than the exposed root of a tree, something that would hold heat and block the wind that had been picking up since midday, carrying with it the first serious cold of the season. She did not let herself think about her father's face. Not yet. That was a door she could not afford to open while she still had tasks in front of her. She followed the tributary upstream, climbing the ground growing rockier, and the trees older and larger as she gained elevation. Here the chestnut oaks and the tulip poplars were enormous, their trunks 3 and 4 feet across, their bark so deeply furrowed it looked like the faces of very old and very patient men. Moss covered the north-facing rocks in thick green pads. The air smelled of cold water and wet leaves and the clean mineral scent of stone. She built a rough shelter that first night at the base of a large chestnut oak, using its exposed roots as 2 of her walls, and cutting a framework of young saplings for the 3rd and 4th sides, thatching them thickly with the dead leaves she raked in armloads from the surrounding ground. It was imperfect. The wind found her at the shoulder and at the knee. She ate a piece of the cornbread and wrapped herself in her spare tunic, and did not sleep so much as drift, surfacing every hour or so to listen to the forest and determine that the sounds she heard were ordinary sounds, the sounds of a living woodland. Nothing more. By the 3rd day, she had moved deep enough into the mountains that the settlements below were completely hidden, the smoke from their chimneys invisible, the sound of the Mill Creek gone. She was above 1,200 feet in country she had never entered before, though Silas had described it to her in enough detail that it felt strangely familiar. Old growth here. The big trees, never logged, some of them older than the nation itself. She found the valley on the fourth afternoon. It was a small thing, a half-mile crease between two ridges oriented east-west, so that it caught the sun for most of the day. A spring ran through it, surfacing from between two large flat rocks and running clear and cold across a floor of gravel and old leaves. The valley walls were steep enough to break the wind from both directions. And there at the far end, where the valley narrowed slightly before the ridgeline rose, stood a tree unlike anything she had seen in her life. It was an oak. She knew it by its bark, by the shape of the remaining leaves still clinging to the upper branches. White oak, but of a size and age that made the white oaks she knew in the valley below look like saplings. Its trunk was wider than the Collier smokehouse. Its lowest branches extended outward 30 feet in each direction before they curved upward, as if the tree had decided long ago that it had more than enough height, and what it wanted now was breadth. The bark was deeply and magnificently furrowed, each ridge and valley in the bark its own small landscape. At the base on the south-facing side, where a massive limb had broken off perhaps a century ago, time had done its work. The heartwood had rotted away in a long, slow process, leaving the sapwood intact, leaving in effect a room. Eliza stood at the entrance and looked in. The opening was 4 feet wide and nearly 6 feet tall. The interior was dry. She could feel the absence of moisture even from the threshold. The air inside still and preserved, smelling of old wood and dust and something she could not quite name, something older than her ability to name things. The floor was compacted earth layered with decades of fallen leaf debris that had blown in and settled. High above, a smaller opening in the trunk admitted a narrow column of gray November light that illuminated the space in a dim cathedral way. She stepped inside. The space was roughly circular and perhaps 9 feet across. The walls were the living wood of the tree, dark and ridged, hard to the touch. She ran her hand along the interior surface and felt the cold smoothness of it, the way the wood had sealed itself over centuries into something almost stone-like. She walked the perimeter, solid, dry, defensible. The wind, she noticed, was completely inaudible inside the space. The thickness of the trunk absorbed it entirely, leaving a silence that was not emptiness, but depth. She stood in the center of the hollow and looked up through the shaft of light and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter than either of those, something that had to do with recognition, as if some part of her, some part that had been looking for a long time without knowing what it was looking for, had finally found the thing. She set her canvas sack down on the floor. The sound it made was small and definitive. She spent the remainder of the daylight examining the space methodically, thinking through what would need to be done. A door of some kind, woven saplings weighted with stone, something that could be moved from inside. A hearth. She could not have fire in the center of a wooden room, but the trunk at the north side was over 3 feet thick, and she had seen chimneys built through less. A bed off the ground. Water from the spring 30 yards away. Food, her stores were nearly gone, but there was sign of rabbit and squirrel throughout the valley, and she had the whittling knife and the knowledge Silas had given her. It would take time. It would take more skill than she currently possessed, and she would make mistakes that cost her. But it was possible. She knew that in the same way she knew weather not as a calculation, but as a reading of things she had learned to read. She began clearing the floor the next morning using a flat piece of shale as a scraper, dragging the accumulated leaf debris out in armloads and piling it against the outside base of the tree for insulation. It was slow, dusty work, and the debris was compacted in places to the density of felt. She worked inward from the entrance, methodical and patient, uncovering the packed earth floor beneath. She was working toward the back of the chamber near the north wall when her shale scraper struck something solid with a knock that was wrong. Too regular, too deliberate. She knelt and brushed the remaining leaf matter away with her hands. A flagstone. Square cut, perhaps 18 inches across, gray, and fitted with the kind of intention that did not occur in nature. A root thick as her wrist had grown over one edge in the years since it had been placed there, anchoring it. She traced the root with her fingers, found where it thinned enough to cut, and worked at it with Silas's knife for the better part of an hour, sawing through the tough fibers in careful strokes. When she finally wedged her fingers into the gap and pulled, the stone shifted. Heavy, but willing. She tilted it aside. Beneath it was a cavity. rectangular, neatly dug into the compacted earth no larger than a hat box. And inside, resting on a bed of dry moss that had gone gray with age, was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather cord. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. The bundle was completely dry. The oilcloth was stiff and cracked at the edges, the leather cord darkened and brittle. This had been here a very long time. The root alone that had grown over it suggested decades at minimum. Whatever was inside had been placed here deliberately with care by someone who had known this space and had reason to hide things in it. She lifted the bundle out of the cavity. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the entrance where the evening light was still just adequate and sat cross-legged on the ground and untied the leather cord with careful fingers. Inside the oilcloth nested in the dry moss were three things. A leather pouch, its drawstring stiff. She loosened it and poured the contents into her palm. Silver coins, old ones heavier than the currency she knew, their faces worn smooth with handling or age. She counted them twice. 23. More money than her father made in 2 months of selling at the mill. A knife. Larger than Silas's whittling knife. A trapper's blade, the handle of dark cherry wood worn smooth with decades of use, the blade of fine steel still holding an edge that caught the last of the light. She turned it over carefully. Along the base of the blade in small stamped letters were the initials E.T. and a book. Small, its leather cover warped and stiff with age, she opened it with the same care she might use on something living. The pages were thin and brown at the edges, the handwriting inside small and precise. She turned to the front cover where a folded sheet of paper had been tucked. She unfolded it. The paper was brittle and the ink had gone brown, but the words were legible. To whoever finds this, it began. My name is Elias Thorne. I lived inside this oak tree for 2 winters, from the autumn of 1828 through the spring of 1830. I came into these mountains after a fever took my wife and both my sons within the same fortnight. I had nothing left in the settled world that I wanted to return to. This hollow tree gave me shelter when I had none, warmth when I could not afford to feel cold, and silence when silence was the only thing I could bear. The coins are from 2 seasons of trapping. The knife was my father's. The book is my record of these years and what I learned in them. I do not know who you are or what brought you here. I know only that this tree does not give itself to people who do not need it. If you are reading this, you are in some difficulty. Use these things. Build a life. And do not let the hardness of what you have come through harden you past the point of receiving kindness, because there is still kindness to be found even in the deep of the mountains. There is one other thing I should tell you. In the crook of the east root, about 6 inches below the surface, I found something when I first began to clear this floor. An oval locket, gold, with the initials M.T. carved on the back. I could not open it. I did not know who had left it or why. I felt it was not mine to take, and so I buried it again a little deeper, wrapped in a square of oilcloth. It is still there as far as I know. Perhaps it belongs to you. Perhaps it belongs to someone you will one day meet. I leave that to God and to time. Whoever you are, may this tree be your anchor in the storm. Elias Thorne. April, 1830. Eliza read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the oilcloth and looked out at the valley where the last light was leaving the highest ridge and the first stars were appearing in the strip of sky visible between the slopes. A locket. Gold. Initialed M.T. She did not know what to make of it. Her mind moved toward the thought and then sideways from it, the way you move your eyes away from something too bright. It was too much to hold alongside everything else. It was a piece of something she did not have the shape of yet. She reached into her pocket and closed her hand around the small carved wren, the smooth birch body, the cocked head, the eye that seemed even in the growing dark to be looking at something just beyond what she could see. She was not the first person who had needed this tree. She was not alone in this at all. The first tears she had shed since her father handed her the canvas sack and looked away came quietly without announcement and did not last long. She let them fall into the dry leaves, and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the letter again. Whoever you are, may this tree be your anchor in the storm. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back inside the journal. She gathered the coins back into their pouch. She picked up the knife with the initials E.T. and turned it once in her hands, feeling the smooth weight of the cherry wood handle. Then she stood, gathered the bundle, and went back inside the hollow oak. Tomorrow she would begin. The first thing she built was a door, and it was terrible. She spent the better part of 2 days cutting young saplings from a thicket along the Spring River birch, flexible enough to weave, and lashing them together with strips of bark she had soaked in the creek overnight to make them pliable. The result was a mat roughly the size of the entrance, stiff in some places and loose in others, with gaps wide enough to admit a cold finger of wind. She propped it in the opening, and it immediately leaned sideways and fell. She propped it again with a forked stick, and it held through the afternoon and then collapsed sometime in the night, landing on her feet and waking her from the shallow sleep she had managed. She lay in the dark and looked at the rectangle of sky visible through the entrance, charcoal gray, no stars, cloud cover moving fast, and she did not allow herself to feel sorry about the door. She simply noted what had gone wrong. The lashing at the upper left corner had not held, because she had used bark that was still too green, not soaked long enough, and it had dried and shrunk around the joint and slipped. She filed this away the way Silas had taught her to file failures, not as evidence of her inadequacy, but as information about the material. In the morning she pulled the mat apart and started again. The second door was better. Not good, but better. It leaned and it breathed, and when the wind came up, the hollow in the late afternoon, it shuddered in its frame like something nervous, but it did not fall. She weighted its base with 3 flat stones from the spring bed and wedged a branch across the inside at chest height to brace it. And when she stepped back and looked at it, she felt something she was careful not to call pride. Pride came before adjustments, and there were still adjustments to make. The loft was next. She needed to sleep off the ground. The cold came up through the packed earth and into her bones during the night in a way that exhaustion could only partly overcome. She cut longer poles this time, selecting carefully for straightness, and laid them across 2 notched uprights. She drove into the earth floor, testing the lashing under her own weight before she trusted it. It held. She covered the poles with a lattice of smaller branches and piled that thickly with pine boughs from the long needled white pines she found on the east-facing slope, their resin sharp and clean in the cold air. When she lay down on it the first night, the boughs released a smell that was so precisely the smell of the hours she had spent in the woods with Silas, the smell of all those quiet afternoons that she had to press her face into them for a moment before she could breathe normally again. The hearth took the longest and cost her the most. She understood the problem clearly from the beginning, which made it no easier to solve. She could not have open fire in the center of a wooden room. The solution was a contained hearth against the thickest section of the trunk, with a flue built to carry the smoke up and out through the smaller opening high in the canopy. She had seen this principle at work in a German settler's cabin near Harrow Bend as a child. A man named Brenner, who had built his chimney out of a mixture of clay and horsehair that he called by a name she couldn't remember. The principle had stayed with her even if the name had not. Clay was available. The spring bank was thick with it, a blue-gray deposit beneath the topsoil that came away in satisfying chunks when she pried at it with a stick. She spent 3 days hauling clay in her canvas sack, mixing it on a flat rock with dry grass and a little water, working it with her hands until it was the consistency of bread dough. She built the hearth body against the north interior wall, the thickest part of the trunk. She estimated nearly 4 feet of solid wood between the fire and the outer bark. She shaped the clay into bricks the length of her forearm, stacking them in a shallow U around a flagstone floor, and let each course dry before adding the next. The flue was harder. She needed to run it upward through the trunk to the existing opening above, and the angle was not straight. She built it in sections, drying each one completely before continuing, checking the draw by holding a handful of dry grass near the opening and watching which way the smoke moved. 3 times she built a section wrong and had to knock it out and start again. Twice she misjudged the drying time and a section cracked when she added weight above it. Once she knocked the entire upper portion loose, reaching across it to adjust the angle, and sat for a long moment in the fallen debris of 3 days' work, her hands gray with clay dust, before she began rebuilding. On the 9th day after she had begun the chimney, she lit a small fire. The kindling caught, and she watched the smoke. For a moment it wavered at the mouth of the flue, not committing to any direction. Her stomach tightened. Then she felt it before she saw it, a slight change in the air pressure, a drawing sensation. The smoke moved upward. slowly at first, then with more confidence, rising up through the clay channel she had built inch by inch over 9 days and disappearing into the column of the trunk, the hollow filled with warmth. Not the cold chasing warmth of a bonfire or the wasteful roar of a hungry stove, but a radiating even warmth that seemed to rise from the walls themselves as the heat distributed through the wood. The light changed too. The firelight reflecting off the interior surfaces gave the space an amber quality, the ridged wood of the walls glowing in a way that made the room look for the first time like a room rather than a wound in a tree. Eliza sat on the edge of her pole loft and held her hands out to the warmth and did not say anything because there was no one to say anything to. She had been in the valley for 18 days. Jedediah Rawls appeared on the 22nd. She heard him before she saw him. The particular cadence of boots on dry leaves that is different from the sound of any animal. The slight crack of a branch placed deliberately, rather than broken by weight shifting. She was at the spring when the sound reached her kneeling to fill her tin cup. She stood and turned before he came into the clearing, which seemed to surprise him. He was older than she had imagined. A working trapper could be past 60, his face a map of everything the mountains could do to a face over a long acquaintance. His beard was the color of old wood ash, and his eyes were a pale winter gray set deep under brows that had apparently decided to grow without any particular limit. He carried a long rifle across his body in the easy way of someone who had carried one so long it had become part of his posture. He wore buckskin that had been patched in several places with different shades of leather, each patch a record of some previous damage. He stopped at the edge of the spring clearing and looked at her. She looked back. He took in her height, her hands clay-stained, still calloused from the work, the knife at her belt, the cup in her hand. He looked at the hollow oak behind her, at the woven door, at the thin line of smoke rising from the upper opening of the trunk. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted. A recalibration. His voice, when it came, was the voice of someone accustomed to going long periods without using it. "You build that chimney yourself?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the smoke. "Draw any good?" "Good enough." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask her name or where she was from or what she was doing alone in a valley that wasn't on any surveyor's map he'd seen. He simply said, "I've been running this line for 11 years. Never seen anyone winter in this hollow. I'm not wintering yet, it's still November." Something moved in his face that might over time become a smile. He didn't push further. He simply said he'd be back through in about 3 weeks, and if she needed anything from the lower country, he was going down toward Greenville before the deep cold set in. She thought about it for a moment. "Steel needle," she said, "and thread if you can get it. I'll pay." He looked at her for another beat, then nodded once, turned, and walked back into the trees. She watched the place where he had disappeared for a while after he was gone. She had not realized until he left how much the sound of a human voice, even a brief and practical exchange, had cost her something to hear, or given her something. She was not sure which. She went back inside and opened Elias Thorne's journal. She had been reading it in the evenings, a few pages at a time by the firelight. Elias wrote the way he apparently did, everything carefully without waste, attending to what was directly in front of him. He recorded temperatures and weather patterns, animal sign, the condition of the creek at different points in the season. He noted his failures with the same precision as his successes, which she found more useful than any advice. Third attempt at the clay chimney, he had written at one point, used more grass in the mix this time. Held. Let it dry 4 full days before lighting. She had read that entry 6 times. It had saved her at least 2 additional failures. But it was a different entry she returned to now. She found the page she had marked with a strip of birch bark and read it again in the firelight. October 14th, 1828. Clearing the floor today, found beneath the east root a small oval locket, gold, initialed MT on the reverse. Could not open the clasp, corroded shut. No way to know how long it has been there or who left it. It does not feel like mine to take. I wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth and buried it again a little deeper beside the root. Perhaps the person it belongs to will come looking for it one day. Perhaps someone else will find it and know what to do. I leave it to God and to time. She had read this passage the first night and marked it, and then not allowed herself to think about it directly, the way you don't look directly at a thing that might mean too much if you look at it squarely. But now, alone in the warm firelit dark, She let herself consider it. MT. Her mother's locket was oval. Her mother's locket was gold. Her mother's name before she became May Collier had been May Tilson. MT. Eliza set the journal down on the loft beside her and looked at the east wall of the hollow where the root Elias had described curved along the base of the trunk before disappearing into the floor. 6 inches down, he had said, wrapped in oilcloth. She sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her shale scraper and knelt beside the east root and began carefully to dig. The oilcloth was there, gray with age, stiff as bark but intact. She lifted it out of the earth with hands that were not entirely steady and unfolded it on the floor in the firelight. Inside was a locket, oval, gold. Or it had been gold. The surface was tarnished to a dull ochre filmed with decades of oxidation, but the metal beneath was unmistakable. She turned it over. On the reverse, in letters that had been engraved with some care, were the initials M.T. She sat back on her heels and looked at the locket in her palm. It was not her mother's. It could not be her mother's. Her mother's locket had been in the family for 3 generations. May herself had said so had said. Her grandmother had worn it before her own mother had worn it before May. That would place its origin at least 60 or 70 years back. And this locket had been here buried in this valley since before 1828, since before Elias had arrived, which meant it had been here at minimum 40 years before she was born. Whoever MT had been, she was not May Tilson Collier. But the initials were the same, and the shape was the same. And the fact of it, a locket belonging to a woman whose initials were MT, left in a hollow tree, buried and preserved, waiting, sat in Eliza's chest with the weight of something that had not finished revealing itself yet. She wrapped the locket carefully in a fresh piece of cloth from the hem of her spare tunic and placed it in her canvas sack alongside Elias's coins. Then she sat beside her small fire until it burned low, turning the fact of it over in her mind, the way she turned wood in her hands, looking for the grain, looking for the direction it wanted to go. Jedediah returned on the 19th day, not the 21st, because the weather had turned and he wanted to be through the high country before the storm that was coming. He brought a steel needle wrapped in a twist of paper, 2 spools of heavy thread, 1 linen, 1 wool, and without comment, a small sack of dried beans and a plug of salt. He left them at the entrance of the hollow while she was checking her snares and was gone before she returned. She found the items arranged on the flagstone just inside the door with the precision of someone who understood that charity given without witness is the only kind worth giving. She spent 3 days stitching rabbit pelts together into a sleeping blanket, working by firelight in the evenings when her hands were too tired for heavier tasks. The needle was revelatory. Her previous attempts at stitching with a sharpened bone had been laborious and uneven, and the linen thread held the pelts together with a firmness that the sinew had not quite managed. The blanket, when it was finished, was lumpy and imperfect and warmer than anything she had slept under in the Collier house. It was Martha Hensley who came next. She arrived with her son Dillard, who was perhaps 30, and said almost nothing, content to stand at the tree line with his hands in his pockets while his mother approached. Martha was a small woman past 60, with white hair pulled tight and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had seen a great deal and revised their opinions accordingly. She carried a folded quilt over one arm, double wedding ring pattern, in blues and reds, obviously made with care and used with love, the edges soft with age. She held it out to Eliza without preamble. Eliza looked at the quilt, and then at the woman's face, and understood that there were no words required here that would not diminish the gesture. She reached out and took it. Martha looked past her at the hollow oak at the door, at the chimney smoke. She looked at Eliza's hands, at the knife at her belt, at the posture of a girl who had been doing hard physical work for a month and had the stance of it now balanced and efficient, no wasted movement. Martha said, "Jedediah told my husband what you've done up here." Eliza waited. "He's not given to exaggeration." A pause. "Neither am I." She turned and walked back to where her son was waiting. At the tree line, she stopped without turning around and said, "I'll send Dillard up with a half bushel of cornmeal before the big cold hits." Then they were gone. Eliza stood holding the quilt for a moment before she brought it inside. She spread it over the pine boughs on her loft and looked at it in the firelight, The careful geometry of the pattern, the colors chosen and arranged by hands that knew what they were doing, the weight of it in her palms. Someone had made this with intention. Someone had decided she was worth it. She reached into her pocket and touched the carved wren, the smooth head, the cocked angle of curiosity. She thought of Silas's hands, the great knobbed knuckles, the permanent wood dust in the creases of his palms, and she thought of how he had placed the bird in her hands on her birthday and said nothing, simply waited while she understood what it was. The same quality of gift, the same refusal to make a performance of generosity. She was learning that kindness in the mountains moved like groundwater, invisible, persistent, finding its way through the stone by paths you couldn't see from the surface. November deepened into December. The snares produced reliably rabbit, mostly the occasional squirrel, and she smoked the meat over the hearth on a rack she had built from green wood, the smoke curing the flesh slowly and filling the hollow with a smell that was beginning to feel like home. Dillard Hensley appeared one gray afternoon with the promised cornmeal and left before she could do more than thank him. She made flatbread on the hearthstone, and the smell of it, the specific smell of corn and fire and the hot flat stone, was so precisely the smell of the Collier kitchen on cold mornings that she had to set the bread aside and go stand in the doorway until the feeling passed. She was not sorry, but she was not nothing either. She had taken to spending the later evening hours with Elias's journal, reading his entries for the corresponding months of his winters here, his observations about weather patterns, about how the cold moved through the valley, about which spots accumulated snow and which stayed clear. His records had a practical value she had not fully anticipated. He had noted that the north-facing slope above the spring held ice long into March and could be relied upon for cold storage. He had noted that the prevailing wind shifted in December and came from the northwest rather than the west, which meant the door needed additional insulation on its left side. She had already discovered this independently, but his confirmation of it gave her a strange comfort, the sense of comparing notes with someone who had solved the same problems on the same ground. It was in this state of quiet absorption on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December that she heard the footsteps. Not Jedediah's careful tread, not the lighter step of Martha's son. These were the footsteps of someone who did not entirely know where they were going, heavier and slightly uncertain, the crunch of dry snow that had fallen 2 days prior compressing under boots that were not accustomed to moving through winter woodland. She closed the journal and set it on the loft. She did not reach for the knife, but she put her hand near it. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A silence. Then Eliza. She knew the voice. She sat very still on the edge of the loft, her feet not quite touching the floor, her hand resting near, but not on the handle of Elias's knife. The firelight moved on the walls. Outside, through the gaps in the woven door, she could see the pale blue of a winter afternoon fading toward dark, and against it, the shape of a man standing with his hands at his sides. She got down from the loft and moved the door open. Caleb was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply not stood opposite him outdoors before, where there were no walls to diminish the difference. He was wearing his heavy wool coat, the one their mother had patched at the left elbow 2 winters back, and he had a wool hat pulled down over his ears. His face was wind-reddened from the walk-up. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and it took her a moment to identify it because it was the last thing she had expected to see there. He was ashamed. He looked past her into the hollow at the hearth fire at the pole loft, with Martha's quilt at the clay chimney, at the hooks she had carved into the walls for hanging her things. He looked at all of it for a long moment without speaking. Then, "Father didn't send me." She waited. "He doesn't know I came." A pause. The wind moved through the valley below them. "Mother wanted to know if you were alive. I told her I'd find out." Eliza looked at him carefully, at the ashamed set of his jaw, which was their father's jaw, at his closed hands. "Are you going to ask me to come back?" she said. "No." He said it quickly, definitively, as if he had thought about this on the way up and reached a conclusion that surprised him. "No, I saw what you've—" He stopped, looked at the chimney again. "No." The silence between them was different from the silence at the house. That silence had been packed with things that could not be said. This one was simply empty waiting. Caleb looked at his boots. Then, without any preliminary, without any softening or circling, he said, "I found the locket on the road from Greenville, 3 weeks before it went missing from the house. Mother dropped it on the way back from market. The clasp had been loose, and I'd meant to tell her, but she'd gone ahead, and I found it in the mud on the road home." He paused. "I was going to give it back that night. But then I thought, how do I explain that I'd had it for 3 weeks and not said anything? So I waited. And then the longer I waited, the worse it got. And then one morning it was gone from where I'd hid it." He stopped. Eliza said, "Where had you hid it?" "In my coat pocket." A silence. "Amos," she said, not as an accusation, simply as a conclusion reached. Caleb's expression confirmed it. He thought he was helping. He put it back in Mother's cedar box while I was out on the fence line. He didn't know he was trying to fix it. And by then Eliza understood the locket was found missing again, and the shape of what had happened had already hardened into what everyone believed. And Caleb had said nothing because saying something would have meant explaining everything, and explaining everything would have meant admitting to 6 weeks of cowardice that he had no language for. She looked at her brother's face, the jaw, the ashamed eyes. She did not feel the thing she had expected to feel, which was some version of vindication. She felt instead something more complicated and less satisfying, a kind of tired comprehension. He had not meant for her to be cast out. He had been afraid, and afraid people do not always think past their own fear, and the consequences had rolled forward without him. She did not forgive him. Not yet. Forgiveness was not a thing she could manufacture in the moment just because the explanation had arrived. But she did not turn him away either. She stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "The fire is small, but it's real." He came inside and stood near the hearth with his hands out to the warmth, and she climbed back up to her loft and waited, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, the blue faded from the sky, and the first stars appeared above the valley. When he left an hour later, he paused at the door. His voice, when it came, was quiet and without inflection, the voice of someone reporting a fact. "Mother asks if you are warm." She looked at him. "Tell her yes." He nodded. He put his wool hat back on. He walked out into the dark. She watched the entrance for a while after the sound of his footsteps had gone. Then she took the wren from her pocket and held it in the firelight, turning it over in her hands. The smooth birch, the cocked head, the eye that was always looking at something just past the horizon of what you could see. She had been cast out for a secret that had not been kept. She had not forgiven the secret, and she had not forgiven the keeping of it. But she understood now that the road between those things and what had happened to her was not straight, and that the people on that road were not entirely the people she had believed them to be. She put the wren away. She banked the fire. She lay down under Martha's quilt and looked up through the high opening in the trunk where a scatter of stars were visible, cold and precise and very far away. She slept. The storm came on a Thursday. She had known it was coming for 2 days, the clouds building over the western ridge with a weight and color that Silas had described to her once as the sky getting ready to mean it. The temperature had dropped steadily since Tuesday, and the animals she usually saw near the spring, the red fox, the deer that came to drink in the early morning, had been absent since Wednesday, gone to wherever they went when they understood something that the land had not announced yet. She spent Wednesday cutting and stacking firewood against the outside wall of the tree, under the shelter of the extended lower branches, enough for 5 days, if she was careful. On Thursday morning, she woke to a sound she had never heard before, and did not need to have heard before to understand. The wind was not moving through the valley. It was occupying it. She looked through the gap at the top of the door and saw nothing but white. Not snow falling, snow moving horizontal, driven by a wind that came in waves, each one stronger than the last. The temperature inside the hollow had dropped overnight. She could see her breath in the firelight. She built the fire up carefully, not panicking, not wasting, reminding herself of what she had stored and what she had prepared. The storm did not stop on Thursday. It did not stop on Friday. On Friday afternoon, in a lull between wind bands, she heard something she had not expected. A sound from the upper part of the trunk, a wet, shifting sound. She looked up. The clay chimney, her 9 days of careful work, had a crack in it. Not a small crack. A crack that ran from the second course upward, widening as it climbed the clay, split by the expansion and contraction of the wood around it as the temperature swung. And through that crack, smoke was not going up. Smoke was finding the path of least resistance, which was sideways into the interior of the hollow. It was not a lot of smoke, not yet. But fire without draft was fire that would choke itself, and a room full of smoke was no different from a room full of cold. She climbed onto the loft for a better look, holding her candle close to the flue without touching it. The crack was bad. It would get worse before the storm broke. She needed to seal it, and the only material she had was the remaining clay she had stored in her sack, which was now, because she had not thought this through carefully enough, frozen solid. The storm howled outside. The crack in the chimney widened almost imperceptibly as the wind shuddered through the trunk. She got down from the loft and sat on the cold floor and thought. She sat on the cold floor and thought, and she thought the way Silas had taught her to think, when a problem presented itself in the field, not at the problem directly, but around it, at the materials available, at the properties of those materials, at what was possible, rather than what was ideal. The clay was frozen, that was a fact. But clay frozen was still clay. It was not destroyed. It was only changed temporarily by cold, and cold was something that fire addressed. She took the canvas sack containing the frozen clay and set it directly beside the hearth, as close to the stone as she could manage without singeing the cloth. Then she rebuilt the fire to its maximum safe size, feeding it carefully with the driest wood from her indoor stack, coaxing the heat upward. She watched the smoke. It was still curling sideways through the crack, still finding the wrong path, but the fire was drawing enough that the interior had not yet become untenable. She had time. Not a great deal of it, but some. While the clay thawed, she thought about the crack. She had built the flue in sections, each section a sleeve of clay surrounding the channel. The crack ran through one of the middle sections, which meant she did not need to rebuild the whole chimney. She needed to pack the crack from outside the flue to press wet clay into the gap and smooth it and let the heat from the fire cure it in place. The problem was reach. The crack was 6 feet up, and her pole loft brought her close, but not close enough to apply real pressure with her hands. She looked around the interior. Her eyes stopped on the whittling knife. She spent 40 minutes carving a paddle from a split length of green birch, flat, thin, long enough to extend her reach by 18 inches. It was rough work, nothing like the careful, patient carving Silas had taught her, but it did not need to be beautiful. It needed to be functional. By the time she finished, the clay at the top of the sack had softened to workable consistency. She pressed it with her thumb, and it yielded cool and dense and cooperative. She packed a handful of it onto the paddle's flat end, climbed to the highest point she could reach on the loft, and pressed the clay into the crack with steady, even force, working from the bottom of the fracture upward, filling it in passes. The wind outside rose to something that was less a sound than a physical presence, a pressure that made the trunk flex almost imperceptibly. She could feel it through her feet on the loft boards. She kept working. It took 4 applications to fill the crack completely. Her arms ached from holding the paddle at extension, and twice she had to stop and step back to let the smoke clear enough for her eyes to stop watering. The fire below her was doing its work. She could see the clay at the base of the repair already beginning to change color slightly as the heat reached it, the surface drying to a lighter gray. She packed the final layer in, smoothed it with the edge of the paddle, and climbed down. She sat on the floor again with her back against the wall and watched the fire. The smoke very slowly corrected itself. The sideways curl at the crack diminished, then stopped. The draw reasserted itself upward, the column of smoke climbing cleanly through the channel and disappearing into the trunk above. The fire straightened and brightened as the oxygen moved properly through it. Outside, the storm continued for another full day. She slept and woke and stoked the fire and slept again, rationing the wood with the precision of someone who had learned to think in days rather than hours. She ate sparingly dried rabbit and cornbread and melted snow for water. She read Elias's journal by firelight and found in his entry for January of 1829 a single line that she read 3 times. The storm lasted 4 days. On the 5th, the sun came, and I sat in the doorway and could not think of a single thing I lacked. On the morning of the 5th day, the wind stopped. The silence it left behind was so complete that it had its own texture. She lay on her loft for a moment, listening to it, learning its shape. Then she moved the door aside and stepped out. The valley was white. Not the gray white of the storm, but a clean, brilliant, eye-watering white. The snow lying deep and unbroken across the ground. Every branch of every tree carrying its own precise weight of it. the spring somewhere beneath a smooth, unbroken surface that gave no indication of the water moving underneath. The sky above the ridgelines was a blue so sharp it seemed structural, as if the vault of it were holding something up. The sun, low and southern in the December sky, hit the snow at an angle that made the whole valley floor shimmer. She stood in the doorway of the hollow oak and breathed. The air was cold enough to feel like a specific thing rather than an absence of warmth. Cold, with a mineral clarity that made the smell of the pine smoke from her chimney extraordinarily precise. She could smell the individual resin of each piece of wood. She had burned the green of the birch, the dryness of the oak, the sweet char of the pine. She was still here. The spring took her 20 minutes to find and break open, chipping through 8 inches of ice with a sharp stone until the water welled up dark and cold and moving. She filled her cup and drank and filled it again. A chickadee landed on the branch 3 feet above her head, regarded her with the complete absence of alarm that small birds reserve for things they have decided are not a threat, and then flew off into the white silence of the pines. She went back inside and put more wood on the fire. It was 2 weeks later that Jedediah brought the woman. He came on a clear afternoon in early January, and he was not alone. Behind him, picking her way through the snow with the careful steps of someone who did not often walk long distances in winter, but was determined to manage it, was an older woman Eliza had never seen. She was perhaps 70, dressed in a heavy black coat that had seen considerable wear, her white hair covered by a wool bonnet. She moved slowly but not weakly. There was intention in every step, the intention of someone who had decided to make this journey and would not be deterred by minor difficulties like distance or cold or age. Jedediah stopped at the edge of the clearing. He had the look of a man who has arranged something and is now stepping back to let it proceed. The woman came forward alone. She stopped a few feet from Eliza and looked at her with eyes that were dark and very direct, and were doing the same thing Eliza's own eyes did when she looked at something she needed to understand, moving over the details, taking inventory, assembling a picture. Her voice when she spoke was measured and a little formal, the voice of someone who had composed what she wanted to say. "My name is Ruth Thorne. My mother's father was a man named Elias Thorne. I have been trying to find the place he described in his letters for 30 years. Eliza stood very still. Ruth Thorne continued, "Jedediah wrote to my cousin in Greenville in November describing a girl who had made a home in a hollow oak in a valley above the Hensley homestead. He described the tree in enough detail that I knew." She paused. "I knew before I set out." Eliza found her voice. "He left a journal." Something moved across Ruth Thorne's face, a complex thing, grief and gratitude arriving at the same time, briefly visible before she composed herself again. "He wrote about this place in his letters home. He sent them with trappers coming east, so they arrived out of order, some of them years late. The last one arrived in 1847, 17 years after he wrote it. By then he was long gone." A pause. "He described the hollow, the flagstone, the cache he left." Eliza stepped back from the door. Ruth Thorne came inside. She stood in the center of the hollow and looked up at the clay chimney, at the pole loft, at the carved hooks along the walls, at the hearth fire. She looked at all of it with the expression of someone seeing a place they have heard described so many times that the place has become mythological, and then discovering that the reality is not smaller than the myth, but differently shaped. She said very quietly, "He would have been glad." The words landed in the warm, fire-lit air of the hollow and stayed there. Eliza reached under the loft and brought out the oilcloth bundle, the journal, the letter, the coins in their pouch. She held it out. Ruth Thorne looked at it for a long moment without taking it. Then she said, "He left it for you. He left it for whoever found it." "Yes," Ruth looked at her steadily. "That is what I said." She did not take the bundle, but she did reach into the pocket of her heavy coat and bring out something of her own. A folded paper, its edges soft with handling, the folds worn almost through. She held it out. Eliza took it and unfolded it with care. It was a letter. The handwriting was the same as the journal, Elias's small, precise script, but the paper was different, whiter, less deteriorated. This had been kept well. March 1830. It began, "My last winter here has ended. I am well, and I am going back to the settled country because I find I am not finished with the world after all. I did not expect this. I came to these mountains to disappear, and instead I learned something that I can only describe as the opposite of disappearing. This tree held me when I could not hold myself. The mountains have a way of giving back what the world takes if you are willing to receive it quietly and without demanding to know why. I have left what I can for whoever comes after me. Reuben Croft, who has been a good friend to me this winter, tells me his family will be in these mountains for generations, and that the mountains have a way of sending people to the places they need. I do not know what to make of that. But I have left the cash, and I have left the letter, and I have left the journal, and I find myself hoping with a specificity that surprises me that whoever finds them will know what to do. If you are reading this, then someone found them. I hope it was enough. E.T. She read the letter through once and then sat down on the edge of the loft because her legs had made a decision she had not been consulted about. Reuben Croft. She looked up at Ruth Thorne. Reuben Croft, she said. Ruth nodded slowly. Jedediah mentioned the family. I thought you might want to know. Silas Croft, who had taught her to read the clouds and hold a knife and see the grain in the wood. Silas Croft, who had made the wren and given it to her and died 2 weeks before the locket disappeared, as if his death had been the first stone that started the whole slide. Silas Croft, whose grandfather had been friends with Elias Thorne in this valley in the winter of 1829. It was not a coincidence exactly. It was something more structural than that. The mountains, Reuben had apparently told Elias, have a way of sending people to the places they need. She thought of Silas teaching her not randomly, not out of general charity, but with a specificity she had never fully understood. The woodcraft, the plant knowledge, the fire discipline, the patience. As if he had known in some way she could not account for what she would eventually need. She did not know what to make of it. She set it beside the other things she did not know what to make of and let it rest there. She reached into her pocket. The wren was smooth and familiar in her palm, the birch worn dark from years of handling. She looked at it for a moment, the cocked head, the ink drop eye, the wings that had never opened but somehow always suggested the possibility of flight. She held it out to Ruth Thorne. Ruth looked at it. She took it very gently, the way you take something you understand is precious without being told. She turned it over once in her fingers, feeling the smoothness of it. Then she held it back out. Eliza looked at her. It belongs in this hollow, Ruth said simply. It was made for someone who would need it here. Eliza took the bird back, closed her fingers around it. They sat together beside the fire for a long time after that, the two of them, the old woman and the girl with the journal between them, and the letter unfolded on the loft. Ruth told her what she knew of Elias. Not the sad parts which Eliza already had from the journal, but the parts that came after the return to the settled world, the years he had lived with a quietness and a groundedness that his family had attributed to age, and that Ruth's mother had always maintained was something he had found in the mountains and brought back with him, carried in him ever after, like a coal kept live beneath its ash. Eliza told her about the chimney and the storm. She told her about Jedediah and Martha's quilt, and Dillard with the cornmeal. She told her about Caleb coming through the snow and the explanation she had not known how to receive. She did not tell her about the locket. Not yet. The locket was a question she had not finished asking. When Ruth stood to leave, the afternoon light was going gold on the upper ridge line, the particular gold of a January sun that has done its modest work for the day and is preparing to depart without making any promises about tomorrow. At the door, Ruth paused. He wrote in one of the early letters that he thought the hollow tree was where things went when the world couldn't hold them. A pause. He meant himself at the time. But I have thought about that line for 30 years. She looked at Eliza. I think he meant more than himself. Then she and Jedediah walked back down through the snow, their figures diminishing against the white until the trees took them, and they were gone. Eliza stood in the doorway until the cold made itself impossible to ignore. She went back inside. She took the locket, MT oval tarnished gold, from the canvas sack where it had rested since November. She set it on the flagstone hearth beside the hearth fire and looked at it in the light. She had been thinking about this for weeks without allowing herself to think about it directly. Now she let herself. The locket had been here before Elias. Elias had found it and buried it again. She had found it and kept it. The initials matched a name that no longer fully existed. May Tilson had become May Collier, and whatever young woman had been May Tilson before Harrow Bend and the farm and the long erosion of the years was someone her mother had never introduced her to. The clasp was corroded, as Elias had noted. She worked at it with the tip of Silas's small knife patient, and gentle the way he had taught her to work at stubborn wood, not forcing following. The mechanism was simple beneath the corrosion. After 20 minutes of careful work, it gave. Inside was a miniature portrait painted on ivory. A young woman, perhaps 20, with dark hair and an expression of composed directness that looked at her from across an uncountable distance of years. Not her mother. Not anyone she recognized. Just a young woman who had existed, had loved something or someone enough to have her face placed inside a gold oval, and had then, for reasons that were gone with her, left it in a hollow tree in the Tennessee mountains. Eliza looked at the face for a long time. She thought about the things that get left behind. Not the things people intend to leave, not the journals and the caches and the letters carefully sealed, but the things that slip away without announcement, the things that end up where no one would have placed them on purpose, waiting in the dark under roots and stone for someone to find them and not know what to do with them and carry them forward anyway. She closed the locket gently. She placed it in the oilcloth with Elias's journal and his letter. She placed it there because it belonged with the other things that this tree had kept, the other evidence that the hollow had been a refuge before her and would perhaps be one after. She was not the beginning of this story, and she was not the end of it. She was somewhere in the middle, and the middle was where you did the work. Spring came the way it always comes in the southern Appalachians, not as a single event, but as a slow renegotiation between winter and something warmer conducted in fits and starts over the course of weeks. The redbud bloomed on the south-facing slopes while the north hollows still held gray ice. The creek swelled with snowmelt and ran loud and brown for 10 days before clearing again to its winter transparency. The ground smelled for the first time since November of something alive and in the process of becoming. Eliza was at the spring on a morning in late March when she found Caleb's letter. Jedediah had left it wedged in the fork of a branch near the hollow's entrance, which was where he left things when she was not there to receive them. A folded piece of paper sealed with a drop of candle wax, her name written on the outside in handwriting. That was her brother's angular and slightly cramped the hand of someone who had never been taught to enjoy writing. She took it inside and sat on the loft and read it. It was short, 3 sentences. Father knows the truth now. Amos told him the way Amos always eventually tells things. There was no apology, but Mother asked me to tell you she thinks of you. She read the 3 sentences twice. Then she folded the letter and held it in her hands for a while, looking at the fire. No apology. She had not expected one, and she found, examining herself honestly, that she did not precisely need one. An apology would have required her to receive it, to respond to it, to enter into a transaction with a family she had been quietly building a life away from. The absence of an apology left her free in a way that an apology would not have. Mother asks if you are warm. She looked around the hollow at the smooth clay chimney repaired and proven, at the double thickness of the woven door, at the 2 rabbit blankets on the loft alongside Martha's quilt, at the row of smoked meat hanging from the carved hooks along the wall, at the small carved hooks at the spoon she had made at the bowl she had traded 2 rabbit pelts for with the Quaker family who had settled 2 valleys over, at the journal, at the oilcloth bundle, at the locket inside it. She was warm. She was more than warm. She reached into her pocket and took out the wren. She set it on the flagstone beside the hearth fire and looked at it there. The small birch bird in the amber firelight, the cocked head, the eye that seemed always to be looking at something just past what she could see. Silas had made it. She had carried it. Ruth had held it for one quiet moment and then returned it to the hollow where it apparently belonged. And here it sat now in the light of a fire built from wood gathered from a valley that had become, in the most fundamental sense she knew, hers. She put the letter in the oilcloth bundle with the journal and the locket and the letter from Elias. Then she carried the bundle to the east root and knelt and pressed the flagstone aside and set it back in the cavity. It had come from the moss, still dry and pale beneath it. She was not ready to carry it away from here. She did not think she would be for a long time. She replaced the flagstone and pressed the edges firm. On a morning in April, she sat in the doorway of the hollow oak and watched the valley come awake. The spring ran clear and spoke continuously to itself over the limestone. The redbud on the east slope had fully opened a haze of pink-purple against the gray-brown of the still-waking hardwoods. A pair of wood thrushes had arrived in the night and were announcing their presence from somewhere in the tulip poplars, their voices spiraling upward through the cool morning air in the particular liquid way that made it impossible to believe the world was anything but a place of profound and ordinary grace. The carved wren sat in her palm as it always did in the early mornings when the day was still deciding what it was going to be. She turned it once in the light. The birch had gone darker with time, and handling the wood, absorbing the oils of her skin over years into a surface that was almost translucent in certain lights, as if the grain had become visible from the inside. The eye still held its precise drop of burned ink, still regarded the world with what she had come to think of not as curiosity but as readiness. She thought about what Ruth had said standing in the doorway in January light. He thought the hollow tree was where things went when the world couldn't hold them. She thought about what had been kept in this tree, a trapper's grief and his 2 winters of hard-earned peace. A gold locket, and the face of a woman whose name was gone. A cache of coins that had bought her a needle and thread and a tin of matches, and the particular dignity of paying her own way. A journal that had told her how to build a chimney and informed her in the plainest language that failure was information and not verdict. And 1 carved bird made by the grandson of a man who had known this tree, given to a girl who would eventually need to know how to find it. She closed her hand around it. There are things the world cannot hold, and so the world puts them down in the places that can. The hollow places, the protected places, the places where time moves differently and the cold cannot reach, and what is buried does not rot, but waits patient as heartwood for the person who will know what to do with it. She had been cast out with nothing. She had found everything she needed in the place where it had been left for her. She was not the first. She would not be the last. The wood thrush called again from the poplars, its voice rising and then resolving into a clean, sustained note that carried across the valley, and then was absorbed by the ridges and the morning and the deep, patient silence of the mountains. The sun reached the east slope, and the redbud lit up pink against the sky. The spring said its continuous word over the stones. She sat in the doorway of her home and let the morning come. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever been the one who found something left behind by someone who needed you to find it, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Every story you share becomes part of this place, and we read each one. And if you would like more stories like this one, quiet stories of what people build when the world puts them down, please consider subscribing. There is more waiting for you whenever you are ready.